So Hume has a very sort of nuanced view of free will, and we didn't quite get to that because we had to end. We were a little bit over because of our introductory comments. So what I want you to sort of leave you with is that, leaving off on David Hume, is that he is what you might call a compatibilist, meaning that free will and determinism are compatible within his philosophy. He went to great extents to sort of show the limitations of free will, but at the same time, he allows for it at least to some degree. The way he actually puts it is that, regarding this free will idea, that all men have agreed about this idea of free will, and that the whole controversy has hereto turned merely on words, he says. That really, what it comes down to is your definition of freedom and your definition of determinism, and that this is kind of this debate's kind of old. It's stale. He's all about showing how the passions determine it, because his main idea that he's trying to get across, at least in the passages that we read last week, are that it is not the reason that's making the calls, unlike what Aquinas is saying. It is actually our passions, our emotions, our affects, our desires that are causing the conditions that are determining what we're asking, the questions we're asking, the routes we're going, and basically limitations on the choices we're making. We're not going to make a choice that doesn't occur to us or that seems to us abhorrent. Right? That's like a bad idea. I'm not going to choose that. In Aquinas is saying that you're sort of making a rational choice, while Hume is saying that that's actually coming from this, to use a more modern term, unconscious sort of source. This, an affect, an emotion, a passion, as Hume would put it. So that's Hume in that regard. So they seem to be, Aquinas and Hume seem to be on opposite ends of the pole, but they're not really. They're not in all things, you might say. Hume certainly was much more of a skeptic than Aquinas, who was, obviously he's a saint, so clearly not much of a skeptic in terms of religion. But they did agree on a lot of things. And one thing in particular is going to be the big subject that we're going to deal with today. And we're going to take a little bit of a detour. Something I hadn't quite planned initially, but I think it's a really good idea before we get into Schopenhauer and Nietzsche to tackle this one idea, and this is the idea of tabula rasa. Who knows what this means? Tabula rasa. Jump in.
Blank slate.
There we go, blank slate. And this is referring to a very old conception. The slate in question was the teaching aid of the ancient Romans. They had this they would have a wooden frame with a wax coating of a piece of slate, so that they would take a stylus and could make notes and then wipe it clean afterwards, kind of like we do with a blackboard. Right? It's the same basic idea. And they'd have this slate with wax. So this is something that comes to us originally from Aristotle. It's one of the first ones to really to describe this, but it's basically been a popular thing for a very long time, although not so much anymore. And we'll talk about why that might be. Both Hume and Aquinas agree on the tabula rasa idea. What are we talking about this idea in terms of a person? We're talking about the notion that there are no innate ideas, right? That we're not, when we're born, essentially we are a blank slate, and it is entirely our environment and our interactions with the world that creates all of the things that Hume is talking about as deterministic, right? And Aquinas would say the same basic thing, that we are all born free, and then maybe are constrained by things that happen later. And so Hume and Aquinas are in agreement on this point, that the mind essentially is like a thing of silly putty that you're going to make impressions into, right? And those impressions create our situation, create our personality, and even to the point of our talents, right? They would say. They might argue against the notion of inborn talent. That is simply, in one person it was encouraged and brought out through, sort of the correct circumstances, and another person it wasn't. One person was exposed to music early on, another person was exposed to literature or to architecture or whatever it may be, and they're going to tend to sort of tend in those directions. Depends on how extreme our idea of tabula rasa is. But it's a really influential notion, this idea of this. And why Hume was sort of drawn to it is kind of an intriguing kind of question, considering how skeptical he was about so many other classic things, and how skeptical he was about Aristotle in particular. Part of this comes from a really new scientific thing. And, science and philosophy, there's a lot of crossover, and where one ends and the other begins kind of as an open question, especially before the Enlightenment. Newton was the guy that we're going to deal with. Now, Newton was a big influence on Hume and all of the Enlightenment thinkers. This is, and if you guys remember maybe from from your high school history classes about what Newton offered, what he did essentially was described a mechanistic world. It's the whole what goes up must come down. It's this idea of forces and action, and basically describing the world as in billiard balls, right? You put a pressure here and something moves, right? One billiard ball hits into the next, and that billiard ball expends its motion against inertia and eventually stops due to inertia, etc. It's a very mechanistic world, and it is a very useful way of describing our typical human concerns. Like if you're building a house, you're using Newtonian physics, right? Not quantum physics, not Einsteinian, not relativity. None of that stuff is all important in what you're doing. It's only when we start to look at the really big and the really small that Newton's physics completely breaks down. It makes and basically stops working. But on a sort of medium plane that humans live on, it works very well, and it was a big breakthrough. This motion. Even before him, you had René Descartes, and he would describe something like gravitation as an occult quality, because the action wasn't seen. It was essentially what Einstein later called spooky action at a distance. It's something that happens and we don't know why. So, the medieval description of that was, angels, obviously. Something has to be pulling it down, right? And it was Newton that began to move into the idea of force as a natural phenomenon, and fields as a natural phenomenon, that sort of thing. So he was so enamored by this new science that he began to look at the human personality along the same lines. So that's very much the tabula rasa view, right? You put a pressure here, and that thing moves. You put an impression, and that impression stays, and that creates the mind that you have. This is the notion of this, and if you're starting to run through immediate flaws in that logic, that's because you're modern, right? And you've been exposed to ideas that are well after this. But we're going to take a look at one particular philosopher. This is our detour into John Locke, because John Locke was an Enlightenment philosopher who was actually a strong influence on Hume and on all of our founding fathers in this country. All the writers of our founding documents had pretty much read this guy. And it is a huge influence on us even today. And I want to look at how, even if you don't agree with tabula rasa, it actually impacts your thinking, probably without even knowing about it, but I'll get to that. So we're going to look at John Locke. This first book of his, which was from 1689, an essay concerning human understanding. He's interested in how we think and how we understand reason, essentially. And this is when one of the first things he does is go into the idea of innate ideas, right? Innate ideas. And his first part of his book is against innate ideas. That's his starting point. Who was here from the symposium like a year or two ago? I know a few guys were, right? You guys remember studying a little bit of Plato, and he had his idea of forms, right? You remember the notion that there are forms in which things participate, and that these forms are innate. This Platonic notion is what these guys are actually fighting against. And this is also what Aristotle was against, and what, therefore, Aquinas was against. This idea that when we're learning something, we're actually rediscovering it from within. There is a dialogue of Plato's called the Meno, and the Meno is a attempt to demonstrate that innate ideas exist by taking a completely uneducated slave boy, where Socrates in this dialogue, brings this kid over to sort of he's like, hey, you kid, get over here. I need to prove a point to this guy. And the way he does it is through asking a series of very well thought out questions, allows the slave boy to, on his own, more or less, minus the questions, rediscover the Pythagorean theorem, right? Because triangles are triangles, and if you think about them hard enough, the idea is that you will break through, that there is something innate about triangles and the human ability to conceive of them that is universal and innate within us, right? So Locke is kind of against this notion, against this idea of rediscovering forms that are there, and sort of innate notions that we have, preferring instead this blank slate. So here's his proof, and here's some of his thoughts on this. Who would like to begin reading Locke?
Sure.
Go for it.
John Locke, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1689, Book 1. For, first, it is evident that all children and idiots have not the least apprehension or thought of them innate ideas. and the want of that is enough to destroy that universal assent which must needs be necessary concomitant of all innate truths. It seeming to me near a contradiction to say that there are truths imprinted on the soul which it perceives or understands not. Imprinting, if it signify anything, being nothing else but the making certain truths to be perceived. For to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. It is therefore children and idiots have souls, have minds, and with those impressions upon them, they must unavoidably perceive them, and necessarily know and assent to these truths, which since they do not, it is evident that there are no such impressions. For if they are not notions naturally imprinted, how can they be innate? And if they are notions imprinted, how can they be unknown? To say a notion imprinted on the mind, and yet at the same time to say that the mind is ignorant of it, and never yet took notice of it, is to make this impression nothing.
So, just to stop there for a second. He is denying an unconscious.
Yeah.
Right? He is denying that possibility. Because again, this is not something that had quite fully occurred. And this is something, and if you study the yogic philosophy, appears there as well. In you know, we read about samskaras and these impressions. There is very little mechanism for them being forgotten, except for this idea of tamas covering them over, with this sort of being covered with inertia, covered with darkness. But it's one of the reasons why, you know, in Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras, there's not a lot of stuff given about hidden ideas and samskaras that need to come to the surface. It's there in a way, but it's a lot of this. It's almost like if you read it with the modern view, there's a lot of workarounds to get to these notions and to keep them really descriptive and valid. And you know, Patanjali was a rationalist. He very much was all about the notion that pure reason, in a very Aquinas kind of way, could overcome the passions and all that kind of good stuff. And I think, you know, ultimately, I would say that with the exception of the notion of karma, which is a pretty big deal, obviously, you could say that Patanjali might have been tabula rasa adherent. Right? He might have said that there were no innate ideas except that which originates from karma, right? Which is just another way of, you know, it's another source of impressions. He has to go to past lives in order to show, he has to accept the doctrine of past lives in order to show things that we could easily, you know, sort of say are, you know, from the unconscious and have settled in from the unconscious early on. Right? Continue.
For if any one may, then, by the same reason, all propositions that are true, and the mind is capable ever of assenting to, may be said to be in the mind, and to be imprinted, since if anyone can be said to be in the mind, which it never yet knew, it must only because it is capable of knowing it, and so the mind is of all truths it shall ever know. Nay, thus truths may be imprinted on the mind, which it never did, nor ever shall know. For a man may live long, and die at last in ignorance of many truths which his mind was capable of knowing, and that with certainty. So that if the capacity of knowing be the natural impression contended for, all the truths a man ever comes to know will, by this account, be every one of them innate. And this great point will amount to no more, but only to a very improper way of speaking, which, whilst it pretends to assert the contrary, says nothing different from those who deny innate principles.
So, this is an argument against Plato. Right? Plato says that, you know, there are the capacity for knowing, right, is present. In the example of the slave boy, etc., he can, you know, by pure reason figure these things out based on innate notions. What Locke is here, you know, sort of here is arguing, is that if you say that that innate ideas exist only in the capacity or readiness to learn something new, then it's like saying nothing at all to him, because again, we're missing some very, you know, sort of important notions about the ways that the mind develops. So that's kind of what that argument is in its essence sort of pointed at. Continuing, please.
If truths can be imprinted on the understanding without being perceived, I can see no difference there can be between any truth the mind is capable of knowing in respect of their original. They must all be innate or adventitious. In vain shall a man go about to distinguish them.
So it's one or the other, according to Locke. It's either all ideas are innate in that, you know, there's a structure there waiting to be discovered, or all ideas are added later. Right? He can't accept a common ground. He can't accept a sort of compatibilist kind of, you know, no gray in this. Not for Locke. So continuing on the same vein, he would like to pick this one up. Go for it, Jane.
If coming to the use of reason were the time of their discovery, it would not prove them innate. But secondly, If it were true that the precise time of their being known and assented to were, when men come to the use of reason, neither would that prove them innate. All that can, with any truth, be meant by this proposition, that men assent to them when they come to their use of reason, is no more but this, that the making of general abstract ideas and the understanding of general names, being a concomitant of the rational faculty and growing up with it, children commonly get not with these general ideas, nor learn the names that stand for them, till having for a good while exercised their reason about familiar and more particular ideas, they are, by their ordinary discourse and actions with others, acknowledged to be capable of rational conversation.
Pause for a second. So a word on kids with this, because he's relying pretty heavily on the idea of children, and that's obviously a natural step. If you're going to observe nature, you're going to look at the kids, right? There's a funny thing about art in this period, and pretty much all periods before like the 19th century. Kids tend to appear as miniature adults. Mm-hmm. And this is something very important about psychology, right? Childhood was considered, it wasn't really a thing, right, for a very long time. They were considered miniature adults and expected to sort of behave along those lines. And there was very little understood about the way a child develops naturally over the course of this, and certainly not how their minds develop. That doesn't come across until much later on. So this understanding of the innateness of children and looking at them as just a blank slate to basically inherit their parents' ideas and being raised. This is one of the reasons that Locke tends to emphasize education in those other works, because it becomes so crucial that you're essentially imprinting these miniature adults to make them into clones of their parents, and sort of continuing society along those lines. So it's his notion of children it can be a little funky. Continuing on.
Assent to supposed innate truths depends on having clear and distinct ideas of what their terms mean, and not on their innateness. A child knows not that 3 and 4 are equal to 7 till he comes to be able to count 7, and has got the name and idea of equality. And then, upon explaining those words, he presently assents to, or rather perceives the truth of that proposition. But neither does he then readily assent, because it is innate truth, nor was his assent wanting till then, because he wanted the use of reason. But the truth of it, something of the same sort, must be true. Well, this collection, this mass of schematisms? Schematisms, innate organizing principles which guides our social and intellectual and individual behavior. That's what I mean to refer to by the concept of human nature.
Sounds like Chomsky.
It is Chomsky, actually. We're missing a page on this for some bizarre reason.
I think it's out of
No, we're missing a page. We're just missing a page.
Yeah, I knew there was something on that.
Why don't you close that? So just to sort of finish up where we left there, I'm going to read that last bit that Jamie was reading with the actual end of the sentence, as opposed to going on to a different author entirely. All right. So, but neither does he readily assent, because it is an innate truth, nor was his assent wanting till then, because he wanted the use of reason. But the truth of it appears to him as soon as he has settled in his mind the clear and distinct ideas that these names stand for. So he's using an argument from mathematics, this whole idea of 3 and 4 making 7, because math has been one of the central sort of sticking points for anyone who believes in innate ideas. Because mathematics has this weird property that is neither directly observable in nature necessarily, at least not all of it, but it is a product purely of reason, you might say. That it's in the mind. The rules of it are always there, and there's something that appears to be within the human reason that allows for it to conform to those rules and play it out, right? So these guys have a tendency to use math, and he's arguing that doesn't make any difference, because what's really happening here, there isn't the relationship between 3 and 4 and 7 isn't innate. It's just it's a natural way that you sort of would elaborate once you know what 3 and 4 and 7 mean. That then the relationship becomes clear, essentially. This is what would later might be called by Kant a synthetic judgment, a judgment that isn't sort of on its own, but combining several factors. And he's basically arguing that is what's going on here. So, as Mark was saying, we had the recorder off. There's this notion in education and in other fields of this idea of a tabula rasa that kind of is still very popular today, despite the fact that there is quite a bit of evidence against it, at least in some ways. How much we are a product of our environment and our impressions and how much is nature is a huge question, and we really don't know clear-cut where one ends and one begins. But if you've been around kids, maybe we can make a quick observation. This isn't really very scientific, but that's okay. Who's seen their kids and or other people's kids and observed what appears to be very early personality that is not directly accountable for, or early interest that is not directly accountable for? It's got a little of that. Yeah, and I think it's a very common idea now that we're looking that there's something innate there, right? Maybe it's a quality of soul that we're seeing, coming into that. And by the way, Aquinas isn't the only one who had something to say about the soul in this regard. He had a contemporary, St. Bonaventure, who was a Platonic follower rather than an Aristotelian. So they had a lot of arguments and a lot of debates. I mean, they agreed on the central doctrines, but when it came to things like the soul, Bonaventure would say that the innate ideas are in the soul, that we're essentially implanted with them by God, and Aquinas says no. No. He says Aristotle was right, not Plato. That instead we are essentially just, putty that is formed by our environment. So even among the sort of the traditional and more religious philosophers, there was debate on this matter, right? Very strong debate, and it really hasn't. No one's resolved it among any of these fields, even among the church. So this idea, however, leads itself to certain conclusions. If we accept tabula rasa, we need to start thinking about what does that imply about other fields of life. Education was the one Mark brought up, but what about government? What about that sort of question? What about the notion that suddenly, if it's truly a tabula, if everyone in this room it was a blank slate when they were born, or before they were born, whenever that you want to cut that off. Where are differences resulting from? They result entirely from the environment. They're not innate, and therefore it is possible that we can achieve a true equality.
Oh God.
At least of circumstances, or at least of starting place. Equality of opportunity, for instance, right, as an example. And it is not very difficult to see why Locke and his ideas about government became really influential and led towards some very familiar ideas. So we're going to read a little bit from his two treatises on government a little bit later, 1690. A couple of short paragraphs. Who wants to read the first one? Wasn't read yet. I would like to jump in. Anyone? Go for it, Spring.
You have that page?
Here.
Pass this right. You can read off.
Just for this side, I can see.
From the two treatises of governance?
Yeah.
Okay. To understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. A state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. There being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another, without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him, by an evident and clear appointment, an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty.
Now, one of the things he's responding to here, which is really key, is he's responding to the notion of absolute monarchy, right? This idea that a king is born a king because that is God's will, and that he is better than everyone else. Right? And this not just goes for the king, of course, but nobility. And this whole notion, this idea of nobility, he's trying to upturn this. He is very much fighting against this, very strongly. This paragraph is great because it sort of sets the scene for what's coming, right? It's this idea that the natural state is equal if you accept tabula rasa and free will, right? We start, the playing field is level. And all equalities, therefore, all inequalities rather, that come after that are inequalities of circumstances, and therefore are essentially unjust, right? Because it is a perversion of the natural state of things. And he's talking here of two things that are contributing to this. One, tabula rasa, the notion that we are a blank slate before we're impressed. We are equal then, right? There is no difference in intellectual capacity or talent. There is just this slate. And the second is that we are perfectly free, as he describes it, to choose. Right? So those are two pretty big assumptions.
And they're really attractive if you're thinking like kind of egalitarian.
And how do we and like we feel that, right?
Yeah, like,
We
oh, that's
feel
so nice.
This notion of equality. There's a natural, I think, attraction to that in that regard, and we're going to explore a little bit of how that kind of plays out, because that is also important, as of course Hume would say, right? It is a passion. It is determining our thinking in some way, but at the same time, we need to examine it, especially to prepare us for Nietzsche, who's coming up later on, who's going to very vehemently disagree with all this stuff. All right, second paragraph. Actually, Sabrina, since you did so well, might as well.
He
continue.
that, in the state of nature, would take away the freedom that belongs to anyone in that state must necessarily be supposed to have a design to take away everything else, that freedom being the foundation of all the rest, as he that in the state of society would take away the freedom belonging to those of that society or commonwealth, must be supposed to design to take away from them everything else, and so be looked on as in a state of war.
Interesting, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly shows a rationale for fighting against monarchists, fighting against the idea of tyranny, right? And the idea of fighting this, fighting against anything that is going to constrain this freedom becomes justified, right? The idea of fighting a social structure in which some are privileged and some are not, all becomes very strongly justified. Now, what are some problems with this group of ideas that are being presented here? What do we notice as some potential difficulties?
I think it leads towards a desire to make all the causes, all the environmental factors somehow even, so that we could make all the people even, so that everybody would have the same opportunities, because that would be just. So we start trying to do that, but to exercise that much control over our environment is not something that we have the capability to do, really. Like, we can't do that.
Sure.
It's also it's sort of a catch-22, I think, because you
Right,
say like,
really.
I want to make everybody perfectly free by controlling the environment such that they are all the same and all have the same opportunity. Well, okay, well then you're not free anymore.
Yeah.
Which one do you want, buddy?
So, yeah, I mean, there's and the more we pick at this, the more it's going to show just how shaky the foundations are. What about the idea of tabula rasa in general? I mean, what do you guys think of this notion? Is this something that, just as you are right now, that you're going to agree with, or is it something that
No.
I just wanted to ask you, why do I have this crazy knee-jerk reaction to just be like, tabula rasa is absolutely false? Like, there's no way.
Yeah, I want to jump up.
But you would never
Are
won
you
for
kidding
half
me?
measures.
Does anyone appeal? Does the idea of tabula rasa appeal to anyone that think that might be true? No.
I think that to a certain extent it is.
Also, to what extent?
Like, there are a lot of things that are learned afterwards. You're not,
Sure,
like,
yes.
I don't think that you're completely blank. Like, the certain things that you're drawn to, like, I don't think I would ever be good at math. That's just not in me to be good at math. But art, I was always drawn to that. So I don't think that...
So, I mean, so the slate isn't blank. It's just, sketched out.
Like the cup is half full, and what you put in the rest of it is fine.
Yeah. So it's a partial acceptance, right? You're saying that you tend to lean towards the notion that we are less formed than formed. Or am I wrong on that?
That we are less formed than formed.
In other words, by innate notions. Are there innate qualities or innate ideas that are
So.
present? Now, I think the reason that no one is jumping up in a spirited, champion of tabula rasa here is because we were all born, or at least we were, we lived most of our lives in a time in which we accepted the truth of genetics,
Nature.
right?
Mhm.
And we recognize that there are very real things that are happening before we're born that are going to create a lot of difference, even before the environment comes into play. It's not even entirely a matter of like the mother's environment that does make a big difference. There are genetic factors that are set at the moment of conception, right? And that can play out in any number of ways, like epigenetics and this sort of notion that it can, that we can, that the manifestation can change. But there is a thing that's going to be different for me as it is for anyone else here, and so on, right? There'll be these differences. One example of this I wanted to go to someone who's much more of a modern philosopher, and I sort of this is from a so this is Noam Chomsky, who's an American philosopher, and he actually had a great televised debate in 1971 with Michel Foucault on Dutch TV, and it is available on YouTube. And I'm going to include a link to that when I post this stuff because it's awesome. It's really great. I mean, it's really good stuff. But this is a section from that debate that it really deals with what we're talking about today. So I want to read Chomsky.
Sure.
Go for it.
A person who knows a language has acquired that knowledge because he approached the learning experience with a very explicit and detailed schematism that tells him what kind of language it is that he's being exposed to. That is, to put it rather loosely, the child must begin with the knowledge, certainly not with the knowledge that he's learning English or Dutch or French or something else, but he does start with the knowledge that he's hearing a human language of a very narrow and explicit type that permits a very small range of variation. And it is because he begins with that highly organized and very restrictive schematism that he is able to make the huge leap from scattered and degenerate data to highly organized knowledge. And furthermore, I should add that we can go a certain distance, I think a rather long distance, toward presenting the properties of this system of knowledge that I would call innate language or instinctive knowledge that the child brings to language learning. And also, we can go a long way towards describing the system that is mentally represented when he has acquired this knowledge. I would claim, then, that this instinctive knowledge, if you like, this schematism that makes it possible to derive complex and intricate knowledge on the basis of very partial data, is one fundamental constituent of human nature. In this case, I think a fundamental constituent because of the role that language plays, not merely in communication, but also in expression of thought and interaction between persons. And I assume that in other domains of human intelligence and other domains of human cognition and behavior, something of the same sort must be true. Well, this collection, this mass of schematisms, innate organizing principles, which guides our social and intellectual and individual behavior, that's what I mean to refer to by the concept of human nature.
Would you argue that those are physiologically based?
Yeah.
They're arising out of the
Yeah,
physiology.
very much. Yeah, he's very
Brain
much
structure.
arguing that.
Yeah.
And he's, of course, he's a linguist. Right? This is something that he's studying in depth, and he's using this as an example of this. There's an idea that language, at first, you might assume that it's really just random sounds that are arbitrarily chosen, but what's basically been found is that is not the case. Is that it isn't arbitrarily chosen, and as different as languages can be, they all fall within certain very definite rules that might seem at first arbitrary, but if you compare them to the sheer amount of possibilities, are actually very narrow, very narrow. So there's some structural stuff happening here. There's a readiness for language, and this is somewhat what Locke was kind of criticizing, that a readiness doesn't necessarily mean it's innate. But he goes a little further than this, and he's saying that that these structures are determining our experience, and this is going to be something that's going to be more important as we head into Schopenhauer, that these structures are determining the experiences along these lines. So he's very much arguing, and I think a lot of people today are going to very much agree with him on this regard, that there are, in some ways, we might not call them innate ideas. In fact, that whole phrase has fallen out of fashion. This is what it was called back in Locke's day. Now you would call it psychological nativism, that there are native structures in the psychology, right, in our psychology. You wouldn't call it innate ideas because then you sound Platonist, which is I guess okay for a philosopher, but if you're trying to be a scientist, it doesn't sound as clear cut. It sounds a little vague and spooky. So that's that little glimpse at Chomsky. But let's look at, if we understand that there is a problem with Locke's view, right, on both his very open concept of free will as well as his idea of tabula rasa, let's look at the implications of that for our own founding ideas. Who wants to read Jefferson? Go for it, Jane.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
This is like, at this point in our culture, self-evident. And yet, look at this. All men are created equal. And they're specifically getting at, and like the original draft of this almost looks like a quote from Locke. Right? This was changed a little bit, and it really is. If you put them side by side, they're really close. All men are created equal. We're talking about tabula rasa. They're created at that basic place, and that we are endowed, therefore, with rights to maintain that initial, neutral, and equal starting point. And this is the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that governments, therefore, are to help us secure these rights rather than derived from the specialness of the monarchs. Right? So essentially, this notion, which is the basic foundation of modern liberalism and especially our culture and our society, is based on principles that no one in this room really accepts.
By denying a subconscious, he's also saying that we don't really have instinct too, right?
Yeah, they're undervaluing instinct. In fact, all of the all of those folks, all the rationalists before, I'd say, 19th century, they didn't make the instincts much of a big deal, except for maybe Hume.
Like, can't you deny blank slate but still say that yes, we're born with like ideas or native physiology that say helps us learn language? That doesn't deny that. I mean, it denies the true idea of blank slate, but it's still sort of a blank slate because we're all starting with the same-ish slate.
But those differences aren't. I mean, are we starting with the same blank slate? I mean, genetics has a huge play on, let's say, intellect, IQ. I mean, is someone who is born with severe learning, difficulties and cognitive limitations, is that person intellectually equal with someone else that is born as a genius, or even just like a sort of an average person? What about physical handicaps? Right? I mean, we want, I think, very much, and I think we act on this, right, on this idea of equality, but I think we need to look at it. And there's a little bit of sort of devil's advocate I'm playing here too, but kind of kicking the hornet's nest a little bit with you guys.
I think part of the where it possibly breaks down is even in the Declaration of Independence, they say that all men are created equal, right? And I think there's possibly a conflation in thinking of, like you say, equal, and are we discussing equal qualities, equal characteristics, or equal value? Because if we're saying everyone has equal value, they all deserve the same rights. Or are we saying because something...
Well, value in what way?
As a human being.
Human value, right?
So what does that mean?
Yeah.
What is the criteria of human value?
I think the only way you could actually make everybody equal is to relate it to something that's not immediately present. Like, you'd have to say we're all equal in the eyes of God.
Yes.
We're all equal
very much
because
so.
we have a soul. That's the only way to say we're all equal. If you say we're all equal, like,
We need to be basing it on
if you use any other chakra, you have to kind of...
Well, you could say that... So it gets less sticky if you say all cats are created equal, right? Because then you're like, well, okay, what? Like, yes, obviously, if you're a cat person, you would say, oh, no, cats they vary in personality, widely, whatever. But you could say cats all deserve not to, I don't know, be punched or thrown up in the air or whatever, bad things could happen to a cat. So you translate it back to human beings, and you say all people are created equal in the sense that they deserve the same level of respect, regardless of their... And I think maybe you might get closer to...
Well, we're
work
painting
with.
in pretty broad strokes here, no doubt,
Mm-hmm.
no doubt. Very huge strokes, yeah. But let's, we can narrow it down just a little bit. And one of the biggest things, and someone said equality before God, right? Jamie said that, right? Which is a very old notion that goes all the way back to the early Christians. The early Christians were very much along that. They believed that very strongly, although most of the history of that church has actually veered very strongly away from that. Certainly in the Middle Ages, with the idea of hierarchies and nobility, that was not the way the church acted, or the way we preached, for that matter, right? So these things sort of shift around. But we can say, instead of equal before God in our secular society, we can say equal before the law.
And I think that that's a lot of what we're really getting at, that there should be an equality before the law. Like, in other words, it doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, a genius, or a moron. You go before the judge, and that judge is going to weigh fairly, and without that, right? With this sort of, without looking at sort of outside things.
He's
Looking at the
supposed
action.
to.
Yeah, supposed to. But we're talking about we're talking about ideals and what we're basing our ideals on, what we're trying for. Obviously, the reality of the situation has never been this, and really the question is an important question to ask whether it can be, or whether it's a futile endeavor.
He's putting too much emphasis on knowledge rather than actual clarity. Because if you eliminate all of the material world, or if you're in a situation where something is beating you on the head or something, you eventually figure out by instinct that you need to move away from that. Or so it's not necessarily gathering all this information.
Yeah. You're gonna like Schopenhauer. No, it's good, because that's that indeed is where we're heading with this. But I wanted to hit this blank slate thing because one of the things Schopenhauer is going to be criticizing. But yeah, those are very good points, and I want you to keep those in your mind. The idea of the body's instinct and its immediate reactions as being this innate quality is going to determine what we're going to really ultimately mean by will in general. Right? So,
I have a quick question about Locke's idea about free will, because I'm actually kind of confused how it could be compatible with tabula rasa. Because if you're a blank slate upon birth and you have that would mean that you sort of have no vector. Like, you don't it can't be determined which way you would choose to go of your own volition, because there's nothing in you to give you a predisposition towards this or that. So that's not, you don't have any free will then.
Well, free will, as it stands, he's basing it closely to the sort of, he's honestly coming out of the same Aristotelian philosophy that Aquinas is basing on it. So you have this notion of a totally independent and completely perfectly free soul that impresses into matter and gives it some of its form, but then is determined by its environment after that. And that Locke is more emphasizing that aspect of it. And this free thing is combined with matter, which creates the possibility of, and that's basically the addition of reason is how it is usually understood. And reason gets this very high thing, and knowledge gets this privileged place in these early modern philosophers, especially the Enlightenment philosophers, right? So free will in this sense for him is the ability to choose between the things that the environment has presented, and he's not really emphasizing how much that. And that's Hume really takes up the torch here and tends to show how strong the passions are in the environmental.
Well, because I would just think that you would go with the impression that's stronger if you're a real tabula rasa. It wouldn't have anything to do with your free will.
I mean, and there's obviously when you get into any of these philosophies, when you start splitting hairs with it, but you get the idea in a sort of a general sense. But let's look at more of these equality distinctions. This is a fun little hornet's nest to kick. Because I think it's important to think about this, and it's a lot of it has to do with the questions again of equality before the law and how do we achieve that. But it oftentimes means for us equality of opportunity is what we're looking for. Because if we assume this idea that we are born without much distinctions and that distinctions are coming later, then really it becomes about achieving a situation in which the causes are equal in order to give us all the equal shot that we feel then we therefore deserve. But if indeed there are differences, those genetic differences, and all this sort of there's the variance in people, then we have all sorts of problems, all sorts of questions. What is innate? What is born into, and what is learned, and how do you change what is learned? Right? If we're looking at, let's say, we look at a poor family and a rich family, right next to each other, right? And we say the rich family is going to be able to give their kids all sorts of advantages. And the poor family is not going to be able to. Their kids, chances are, unless it happens to be a matter of innate talent, where the poor kids happen to be geniuses and the rich kids happen to be not so genius. But we'll assume equal talent for a second. Equal talent and rich and poor. If the talent's equal, the rich kids are going to have all the advantages every time. They're always going to be ahead. So there's this urge to change the situation with the poor kids. But why? But is it just economics? Or are there social factors in there that are limiting that poor family? And how do you change that without literally changing their parenting style? without actually sending a government in there or some other force in there to override the way that they're teaching, and we lose some freedom, right? So there's a lot of really sticky questions when we start to look at this, because I think part of the reason is our ideas of equality are often unconsciously, unless we start to really look at these guys and whatnot, are going to be based on an assumption of equality, even if we might not be able to see where that equality lies, right? We want there to be equality because I think there's something in us looking for that. Maybe that's socialized to some degree, but I don't think it is entirely. I think this idea of fairness is pretty innate as ideas go. That we're looking for fairness, and we have this assumption of equality, but it's an assumption, and it's something that we are going to have to think about. And when we get into Nietzsche, he is going to challenge us on this. He is going to challenge us hardcore on this. He is all about inequality in his way, right? But not inequality based on birth, based on something that's based on talent, you might say, right? He's essentially an elitist in that regard.
I think it might have to do a little bit with math in a way, because if you look at when we think about these things, we're always abstracting what we're thinking about when we think about equality. Mm-hmm. So we think about people, and we're like, okay, I'm one person, and then everybody else themselves is one person. One is equal to one, so I'm equal to other people.
And that is actually one of the arguments used. Yeah, totally.
It's also curious that we're saying equality. You're using the rich and poor example. We're saying okay, so they have all the advantages. They're rich, and we're also making a value judgment saying, and clearly that is the best life, and this is the best thing, right? So I'm not necessarily saying that there aren't advantages to having lots of money.
It's a matter of inequality of resources.
The yogic standpoint might not necessarily say that at all. Might say, well, there's some disadvantages. We're we're asking what is a good life, and of course that's what philosophy is about.
Absolutely, and there's I think in a lot of religions there has been a privileging of the poor state. The meek will inherit the earth. This sort of notion, right? All these concepts that, in fact, rich, the whole, what do you call it? A camel will come before, through an eye of a needle before a rich man gets into heaven. All these notions that the rich create a problem and can create that. Yes, absolutely. But when we're talking about a purely secular thing, and Locke is very secular in this regard, and even though he leaves plenty of room in his philosophy for God. In fact, he goes on and on and on about proofs for God in the books that we're quoting here. But on a purely secular level, we're talking about resources. We're talking about the possibility and whether or not those resources are there and equality.
My question is more, so I think that, in a secular equation, the financial status is basically the metric. Is the urge for equality a secular one? Or is it something else? I think that's
a good question. Is the urge for equality a secular one or not?
Yeah.
I think it depends on what the spiritual, religious side of it is. What their
what's the unconscious? Well, if we're granting this that there's an unconscious, and it's pushing this urge up, this representation of equality to us. What's it doing with it, and why do we have it? I'm not even positing creation or deities
absolutely.
Or anything.
I think
even if it's genetic,
the idea
why is
of
it there?
equality is a really interesting one because it is so pertinent. And if we accept that there are some innate ideas, we have to accept that equality is probably one of them, or at least the idea of fairness, if not equality. There's some sort of equitable kind of notion, and where that originates from. If you look at kids, they're definitely concerned with what's fair and unfair play, but if you actually watch them. They're really concerned about making sure that they get what they imagine to be a fair share, and are perfectly happy to stiff other people.
Monkeys too.
Wasps also very clear.
Adults.
And this is one of the troubles. Was that?
Wasps, they know fairness.
So he's saying that basically you don't have any self-governing ability, and he's kind of confusing the idea of the need that we need to be social with the need for authority. And I think that a lot of people, the reason why, because he's saying that everything gets imprinted on you rather than the fact that you take from things and choose how it gets.
No, that's it. I'm glad you brought that up because that's a misconception. I think I want to clear that up. He's not saying that. He's actually pro-autonomy. He believes that despite that, we are completely autonomous and equal in our autonomy and equal in self-government. That he believes that at basis, unless we were essentially stiffed in our circumstances, we have equal basis to make choices for ourselves. And this is blatantly not true because there are people who have cognitive abilities that cannot do that, who are not autonomous. that cannot live without others, and really, can any of us? But Locke is pushing forward this notion that every individual is perfectly free, perfectly autonomous by their nature, and any variance of this is essentially a perversion of justice. Right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's that free will component added to who the impressions are, but the free will is still free, and it's still somehow autonomous in this notion. There's two substances here, right? He accepts the Descartes split. There is mind or spirit, or whatever you want to call it, and then there is matter to these guys still.
In this time period, how were the mentally ill viewed? Like, was he considering any of those kind of like offshoots?
Oftentimes, at least, I mean, this is the time when he's writing. There's a weird sort of back and forth. This is a time of transition. Prior to this, a lot of mental illness was considered either straight up demonic possession, or it was considered to be a moral lapse, which is related, really, if you open yourself to the idea of demonic influence. And this is the beginning of when that's starting to change, but they mostly just lock them away. Mm-hmm. Like this is the time of the madhouses, and,
mm-hmm.
And Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam, right? Sort of notion. If you're really curious about that, the guy Chomsky debated, Foucault, wrote a great book about the history of treating mental disorders, and a criticism of how much of the idea
mm-hmm.
of the insane is a socially constructed idea. I definitely recommend that book. I think I have it at home. I'll lend it to you. But yeah, so back to where we're getting with this. I wanted to sort of bring this stuff up, and as I think Mark was mentioning it a little bit earlier on, when we talk about the problems and the limitations of these questions, that this can lead to sort of dystopian scenarios. If you ever read like Brave New World or 1984, these are oftentimes an attempt to create actual equality. Or you look at sort of a lot of the horrors of Soviet communism, which were an attempt to have an equation of property, an equation of resources, and that didn't really work out even among that, right? So there's that kind of stuff. However, I want to point out one more thing. Despite the questions that we're bringing into the notions of equality and what its limits are, I'm bringing this somewhat as a devil's advocate, somewhat to prepare for Nietzsche, and at the same time, we are all contributing to something that is an attempt to level that playing field. We're donating money to First Book, right? What is First Book about? The whole notion of this charity, which I'm very much in support of, is that it's a proven fact that kids who grow up with books in the house, have that access, come out much, basically are much more advantaged than those who do not. This charity seeks to correct that directly by giving them home libraries, letting them take them home from school, and to give them that opportunity, essentially to create the situation for more equality later on, and at least to draw out, those who have the predisposition and the natural ambition to do that, right? So we're, in a way, regardless, we might say that this is essentially, there are some questions here, and I think some really important questions, and that's one, I think, the biggest values of studying Nietzsche in particular, is that he really exposes those questions and makes us think really hard about these treasured notions, and sees where they can get us into trouble. That's kind of a fun stuff. So in the last little bit, we're going to have some time to move on to, we have to pass through kind of Kant. I'm kind of skipping over him. Immanuel Kant was this interesting, a really huge figure, influenced by Hume, but didn't agree with him on a lot of things. He was pro-free will. He was pro-tabula rasa, sort of, sort of. And here's where this begins to shift. There's a reason we're not reading Kant, and it's because it is largely unintelligible. It's really, his stuff is so dry, so ridiculous. I'm going to read you a quote to satisfy your curiosity and to show you why we're not reading it. One of the things he's all about is this notion, if he attempts to make this distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. Essentially that when we perceive something, we perceive only a surface, right? We perceive a phenomenon. And the thing that we're perceiving is unknown to us. And if we accept that we bring certain qualities to this is what Kant's all about, is that we bring something to perception. That the eyes are not like a glass window, right? That instead we're perceiving something that's present. And neuroscience is back to this idea, right? What we bring to it, Kant described some of those things that turned out to not be so true. But neuroscience is back to the basic notion that what we are perceiving right now, when you look at me, is a hologram created in your brain because light hits your eyes and then is reconstructed. It isn't like looking through a window, right? The eyes aren't windows; they're globs of stuff, and they send signals, and that's all it is. And those signals are interpreted. It's like saying that believing that your perception of this room is the actual room is basically the same as believing that when you look at a room on TV, that you're looking at an actual room present in your box TV, right? It is the same mistake, right? So, to get into this idea, he says that there are certain judgments that we're able to do without any sort of sensory input, like math. He usually uses an example, and there's some that are added after the fact. Those judgments that we can make without even getting off our couch, so to speak, he called a priori, or coming before, and those judgments which are based on sensory stuff he calls a posteriori. He has a lot of jargon like this, and Schopenhauer accused him of being addicted to it. So we'll see what's going on with this. I'm going to read just this little quote. If we have a proposition which contains the idea of necessity in its very conception, it is a judgment a priori. An empirical a posteriori judgment never exhibits strict absolute, but only assumed and comparative universality by induction. Therefore, the most we can say is, so far as we have hitherto observed, there is no exception to this or that rule. If, on the other hand, a judgment carries with it strict and absolute universality, that is, admits of no possible exception, it is not derived from experience, but is valid absolutely a priori. Necessity and strict universality, therefore, are infallible tests for distinguishing pure a priori from empirical a posteriori knowledge, and are inseparably connected with each other. The attempt to think these objects will hereafter furnish an excellent test of the new method of thought which we have adopted, and which is based on the principle that we can only know things a priori that we ourselves place in them. Huh? That all made sense, right?
I really like it.
Yeah. So we're not going to read Kant. It's important to recognize that the stuff that's going to happen in Schopenhauer that we're going to encounter here is a lot of it is going to be coming initially from Kant. That's why I sort of want to mention him briefly, because there's a huge influence on it. This idea that we bring something to our perception, that we are essentially creatively constructing the appearance of reality, the phenomenon in question, is important. Now, Kant still kept a hold of that two-substance model, right? So Kant believed that there was the phenomenal world, and there's a noumenal world behind that is never known, unknowable, and he connects this with the divine realm, with Plato's forms, and indeed with the idea of God, which he very much had to sort of work in his philosophy through this way. So it was kept in this other world. Schopenhauer denies this split. He says that they are not ultimately separate things, that there is no noumenal world, that there is just one world, and things appear, and that what he is describing really is an appearance of things and another substance behind them. Kant says that substance is inherently unknowable. The thing in and of itself, the thing as such, is unknowable. Schopenhauer says, not so. That thing is known. We know it only through one way, and we can sort of postulate it out to other things. The thing in and of itself, Schopenhauer says, is the will that we feel, and feeling that will is not a representation. Right? There's the world as representation, there's the world that appears to us, and there is the immediate something that we are responding to, and that he is describing as the will. Really a quick background on Schopenhauer. He's this guy's a figure in Germany, early 1800s we're into now, right? He was he was involved in sort of academic stuff. He never really got married, although he liked to date girls who were like, he was in his 40s dating 17-year-old ballerinas and stuff like that. But he was a bit of a curmudgeon. He didn't really leave his house much, especially towards the end of his life, and he wasn't really very well accepted early on. Everyone was really in love with Kant, and the follower of Kant, a guy named Hegel. Someone asked about an optimistic philosopher. Hegel's your guy, because he believed that we were inevitably and inexorably progressing towards the equality that Locke was describing, towards democracy, towards all these things, and Schopenhauer was saying, no, we're all doomed, essentially. He actually, he hated Hegel so much, he actually set up his lectures at the same time as Hegel was lecturing, and then he got really sad because no one showed up to his lectures, and everyone went to Hegel. And this occurred. This went on like this. The first edition of this of the book that he wrote here was 1818, and in 1848 there were a series of revolutions across Europe, and they were almost universally crushed by the established monarchists. And this got everyone to think that Hegel might have been wrong after all. And suddenly they started looking at Schopenhauer, and suddenly he became a little famous. He still was a curmudgeon. He still didn't want to leave his house, but his work was suddenly reevaluated and was a tremendous influence on Nietzsche in particular. So we're just going to read a little bit, well, not a little bit, quite a bit actually, of. We may not get through all this today, but we're going to get a start with it. I want to read the first paragraph. Jump into this. Go for it. This is from the very beginning of his book.
The world is my representation. This is the truth valid with reference to every living and knowing being, although man alone can bring it into reflective, abstract consciousness. If he really does so, philosophical discernment has dawned on him. It then becomes clear and certain to him that he does not know a sun and an earth, but only an eye that sees a sun, a hand that feels an earth, that the world around him is there only as representation, in other words, only in reference to another thing, namely that which represents, and this is himself. If any truth can be expressed a priori, it is this, for it is the statement of that form of all possible and conceivable experience, a form that is more general than all others, than time, space, and causality, for all these presuppose it.
Pause for a second. Those three things he lists are Kantian categories that we bring to the experience. Those are things that Kant is specifically talking about. He uses a priori as another, he's referencing Kant. And those categories that you're saying there, that are based on representation, are directly referencing Kant. So continue.
No truth is more certain, more independent of all others, and less in need of proof than this, namely that everything that exists for knowledge, and hence the whole of the world, is only object in relation to the subject, perception of the perceiver, in a word, representation. Naturally, this holds good of the present as well as of the past and future, or what is remotest as well as what is nearest. For it holds good of time and space themselves, in which alone all these distinctions arise. Everything that in any way belongs and can belong to the world is inevitably associated with this being, conditioned by the subject, and it exists only for the subject. The world is representation.
So, if you're familiar with the yogic idea of Maya, that the world is not what it seems, that it is an appearance, an illusion, and that whatever the world really is underneath that, right? This is something that's very much in line with this. And as I mentioned in the last class, Schopenhauer was the very first of the Western philosophers who really engaged with Indian ideas, right? So this isn't the first time. This is only the first time that we've come across this connection, but we're going to really get into how much overlap there was next time. But this first part, this is the first half of his idea, that the world is the representation. It is based on some stuff that we add to it, and it is represented back to us. It is not what it appears to be, right? Whatever it actually may be, we'll get to that in a moment, but that it is not what it appears. That makes sense to everybody? Right? All right, so moving on to the next one. Who wants to read this larger book? Go for it.
The meaning that I'm looking for of the world that stands before me simply as my representation, or the transition from it as mere representation of the knowing subject to whatever it may be besides this, could never be found if the investigator himself were nothing more than the purely knowing subject, a winged cherub without a body. But he himself is rooted in the world, and thus he finds himself in it as an individual. In other words, his knowledge, which is conditional supporter of the whole world as representation, is nevertheless given entirely through the medium of a body, and the affections of this body are, as we have shown, the starting point for the understanding in its perception of this world. For the purely knowing subject as such, this body is a representation like any other, an object among objects. Its movements and actions are so far known to him in just the same way as the changes of all other objects of perception, and they would be equally strange and incomprehensible to him if their meaning were not unraveled for him in an entirely different way. Otherwise, he would see his conduct follow on presented motives with the constancy of law of nature, just as the changes of other objects follow upon causes, stimuli, and motives. but he would be no nearer to understanding the influence of the motives than he is to understanding the connection with its cause of any other effect that appears before him. He would then also call the inner, to him incomprehensible, nature of those manifestations and actions of his body a force, a quality, or a character, just as he pleased, but he would not have further insight into it. All of this, however, is not the case. On the contrary, the answer to the riddle is given to the object of knowledge appearing as individual, and this answer is given in the word will. This and this alone gives him the key to his own phenomenon, reveals to him the significance, and shows him the inner mechanism of his being, his actions, his movements. To the subject of knowing, who appears as an individual only through his identity with the body, this body is given in two entirely different ways. It is given in intelligent perception as representation, as an object among objects, liable to the laws of those objects. But it is also given in quite a different way, namely as what is known immediately to everyone and is denoted by the word will. Every true act of his will is also at once and inevitably a movement of his body. He cannot actually will the act without at the same time being aware that it appears as a movement to the body. The act of will and the action of the body are not two different states objectively known, connected by the bond of causality. They do not stand in relation of cause and effect, but are one and the same thing, though given in two entirely different ways, first quite directly, and then in perception for the understanding. The action of the body is nothing but the act of will objectified, i.e., translated into perception. Later on, we shall see that this applies to every movement of the body, not merely to movement following on motives, but also to involuntary movement following on mere stimuli. Indeed, that the whole body is nothing but the objectified will, i.e., will that has
Become representation.
become representation.
Okay. So, it's a lot, right? I know. It's heavy stuff, this Schopenhauer guy. I love him, though. It's this fascinating stuff because we're talking about the representation is everything else, and then the one thing other than that he's describing as this idea of will, and he's describing that we can know this only through the body because we can't know it in another body, right? For instance, you can imagine your body. You can look and go, hey, check it out, hand. You can be aware that bodies need food, right? That other bodies need food. You can be aware that you need food, and you say, okay, well, this is because it's refueling my cells, and there's a representation element there. But this is not the same as hunger. Hunger is not a representation, but an immediate experience, according to Schopenhauer. It is something that is an immediate pressure, a motive. We have that will to eat, is what he's basically saying is going on here. There is this will that is pushing us out, and that is going to create actions. We all know what it is to be hangry, right? Hangry, right? That expression, right? Where you get hungry, you just get cranky, right? What he's saying is that if we were just a sort of a winged cherub, essentially we were just this sort of separated soul, this transcendental idea, that we would simply be looking at that hunger as a representation, no more different than, wow, Mark is hungry, right? I'm not really involved. It doesn't really affect me. It's not going to change my motives unless I want to help him out or whatever. It would be this distance. But hunger, when we have it ourselves, is in a very different quality of experience. This he then takes and it basically spreads out to every action of will, every action of ourselves relates back to this notion. Right? So he's getting rid of the idea of two worlds here. He's breaking it down into one thing because really the representation isn't another world. It is representation of the will, right? It is the will itself that is being represented back to itself. So there's only one substance. And if you study the yogic stuff, we see where we might be getting this from, right? The whole Purusha Prakriti thing, and then there's Brahman, right? To this guy, the will was pretty much Brahman, to the point where he didn't live alone in his, curmudgeonly, house. He had cats and he had a dog. Actually, it's this whole series of dogs, which he named the same thing, Atman. Right? So, considering on right we left off, please.
Therefore the body, which in the previous book I called the immediate object, according to the one-sided viewpoint deliberately taken there, namely of the representation, will here from another point of view be called the objectivity of the will. Therefore, in a certain sense, it can also be said that the will is a knowledge a priori of the body, and that the body is knowledge a posteriori of the will. Resolutions of the will relating to the future are mere deliberations of reason about what will be willed at some time, not real acts of the will. Only the carrying out stamps the resolve. Till then, it is mere intention that can be altered. It exists only in reason in the abstract. Only in reflection are willing and acting different. In reality, they are one. Every true, genuine, immediate act of the will is also at once and directly a manifest act of the body, and correspondingly, on the other hand, every impression of the body is also at once and directly an impression on the will. As such, it is called pain when it is contrary to the will, and gratification or pleasure when in accordance with the will. However, we are quite wrong in calling pain and pleasure representations, for they are not these at all, but immediate affections of the will in its phenomenon, the body, an enforced, instantaneous, willing or not willing of the impression undergone by the body.
So much of that is what I was just saying along those lines. But we can go kind of beyond this. He's basically saying that, and really a lot of the question we've had this whole session today is there something called human nature? That's what we mean by innate ideas, isn't it? Right? Is there a nature that we share? Is there something that is our nature? Schopenhauer says unequivocally, yes. That is what he means by will. So when we talk about the body as a objectification of this, he means kind of two things, I think. One, that our experience of it as body, as a separate thing, is a representation, and it is therefore objected by the will. But he also means that it is given rise by directly the will of the human organism. In other words, he would actually put it this way. It takes a little bit further. That the throat is an objectification of the will to eat. Right? We have a will to take in sustenance, and therefore the body that we have was given rise in order to meet that need, to basically to manifest that will in the world. Right? This is about less than 10 years. The second edition came out 10 years before Darwin, Origin of the Species. The original edition came out probably 50 years, I think, a little less than 50 years before, like 40 years before The Origin of the Species. Which, by the way, Darwin's going to have a huge impact on Nietzsche, combined with Schopenhauer, right? But at this level, we're actually looking a little bit before him, and it's this kind of thinking that I think is heading in a very similar direction. And it also is heading in a direction as a very secular direction of a notion that it is the body and that the mind and body are one. Something that the psychologists are going to follow him in later on, right? Coming from their medicine background in particular, right? So final paragraph, then, Mark.
Finally, the knowledge I have of my will, although an immediate knowledge, cannot be separated from that of my body. I know my will not as a whole, not as a unity, not completely according to its nature, but only its individual acts, and hence in time, which is the form of my body's appearing, as it is of every body. Therefore, the body is the condition of knowledge of my will. Accordingly, I cannot really imagine this will without my body.
So, from the very beginning of this, I just want to touch on this idea, right? I know my will not as a whole, not as a unity, but it's in individual acts. Who here has ever been surprised by something they did? Right? Yeah. And we talk about instincts, right? You might think of yourself, maybe be calm, and then something happens and it threatens you, and you might have been the most non-violent person up to that point, and suddenly you hit back, you react, and you just do, because there's that will to live, you might say, that is pushing you, right? So, what we know of ourselves is an abstraction, a representation of ourselves. But by knowing the immediate things, essentially pleasure and pain, but very importantly, desire, do we begin to formulate a more accurate understanding of the actual nature that is giving rise to all of the things we are doing. In other words, according to Schopenhauer's idea, that which determines us is being lumped into this idea of the will, the human nature as an active force reaching out to the world. We're going to go much more into this idea of will. We're going to spend the entire next session on Schopenhauer exclusively, and we'll with some side sort of forays into Eastern philosophy to see where he's getting some of these ideas from. But thank you guys. Another great session. Any questions before we end on what we have of Schopenhauer thus far? All right. I'll see you next time.